Thank you, Madam Chair. I have an amendment to move, and I'll hand it to the pages, and they've aged a bit, but they're looking good. They're looking great.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'd like to move an amendment to Bill 6.
Madam Chair, I have an amendment to Bill 6.
Madam Chair, I'm very pleased this evening to move an amendment that I believe would provide some improvement to this bill, and I'll first give it to the pages for distribution.
The honourable member for Vermillion-Lloydminster.
Mr. Speaker, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I must confess that as this bill has progressed through the House, I struggled with what I would say in third reading. I spoke on second reading, I spoke on the referral motion, I spoke on a couple of the debates on a couple of the amendments. And I thought to myself, what could I possibly add in third reading that hasn't already been said? What perspective could I possibly offer that hasn't been introduced? And I struggled with that. And as a lot of us are, we're all running on a little bit less sleep than we might be otherwise accustomed to. But what I returned to was some comments made by the honourable member for West Yellowhead yesterday. And I will tell you, Mr. Speaker, that that's why we have debates in this House. Is because perspectives, there are jewels and nuggets in what people say on both sides of the House that can trigger thought, that can trigger us to become better legislators. And the member for West Yellowhead was very passionate in stating that this is about fundamental human rights, that this bill is about ensuring the absolute fundamental human right of a worker to refuse work, and it's about protecting vulnerable paid farm workers. And what that made me think when he said the term human rights, I thought of our colleague, the honourable member for Calgary Greenway, because he was recognized as the most passionate defender of human rights in our caucus. And I thought to myself, what would Mita say? And of course, since we aren't able to ask him, we go back to the past notes. And I brought out the notes from his speech on third reading, pages 269 and 270 of Hansard. And Mr. Speaker, I'm going to copy this speech and keep it in my desk, because it reminds us of what the strongest advocate for human rights would say. And what he said on that night is, these are proud people in Alberta with strong conservative values and an entrepreneurial spirit that will ensure that the wrongs are corrected. They will ensure these wrongs are corrected. And he went on to say, you best be, and he was addressing the government, you'd best be prepared to make sure people who have income that strong, dignified people who are used to working for themselves are making a go of their own entrepreneurial pursuits, are not left to rely on the charity of others. Mr. Speaker, I had the best seat in the House when the member for Calgary Greenway gave that speech. I was sitting here, and he went on to quote a Punjabi expression about the strength of my own chest. And I have tremendous, tremendous faith in the farmers and ranchers of Alberta, because I know the strength of their chests. And I know that they are a strong, resilient people, and I know that they will come through this. And I also know those people, Mr. Speaker, with regard to the right to refuse dangerous work. And they find this suggestion baffling, because whenever I ask them about the right to refuse dangerous work, they tell me two things. If I know the situation is dangerous, I would never put an employee of mine into that position. That's my job. And I know that if you're in a leadership position, if you are in an employer position, that is typical of what happens, not just in the farm. I know that if we had a nasty dog or a cranky cat or a cow that wanted to kill you, I would never have an associate say, oh, you want to go look after that cow? Never. I would take on that risk, that responsibility myself. You don't delegate stuff like that. So when we say that workers should have the right to refuse dangerous work, most farmers I talk to, they look at me and they said, well, no, they don't have to refuse it because I don't ask them to do it. The second area protecting vulnerable paid farm workers. Well, the truth of that matter, Mr. Speaker, is that in many, many cases across the province, that is already being done. That is being done by the forward-thinking, concerned employers that employ farm workers in this province, and they look after their employees, and they look after them because they have to, because the labor market is very competitive, and they know that the laborer is mobile, and that these laborers can work anywhere they want. And so, what the real tragedy of Bill 6 is, what the real tragedy, in my view, of Bill 6 is that just about everybody I've talked to agrees on those principles. They agree that farm workers should be able to refuse unsafe work. We get that. We agree with the government on that. And we get that farm workers should have basic rights to be protected in the event of injury or in the event of a fatality. We get that. Farmers get that. We agree with you. And if we could somehow, through skillful crafting of legislation, confine what we're talking about to those issues, this issue would have been looked after, and we could have all said, we have done good work for Albertans. Agreed. And we would be satisfied with that, and I would suggest we could all be very pleased with that. The problem with this legislation is that it goes on to do many, many, many other things. Bingo. And that is the issue here. It's those other things that this legislation does that have been put out there to the farmers and then retracted, been said that's a misunderstanding, and then said, no, it's not a misunderstanding. All of the confusion that has been created initially by the government. Now, has some of it been added to for political purposes? That's right, too. The member for Peace River was right. That has happened as well. And you know, quite frankly, it does us all as legislators a disservice when we do that. All of us. It does a disservice when we say more than what is there, when we distort what is really there, and when we talk about the intent differently. You know, I have tried as best as I can whenever I've addressed this issue in this bill to stay away from the partisan side of things. This is not an issue about parties. This is not an issue, as some have suggested, that will unite the right. This is an issue that should be uniting what's right, not the right. And that is why there is support for this measure, not just in the official opposition, not just in our caucus, but also from the Alberta Party and from Albertans across this province, regardless of political stripe. Because the legislation, simply put, goes too far. The legislation, and even though the government has done everything in its power to correct some of the misconceptions, to correct some of the things that are now no longer part of it, to move amendments that the amendment that did provide some clarification, and that is why I voted for that amendment. The problem is there needed to be much more of that, and the problem was that this government needed to recognize that it had responsibility for the misunderstanding it created, and because of that, you have broken the trust of the farmers and ranchers in this province. And when you make that error, when that error is made, and you've acknowledged that error, when that error is made, you must pause the legislation and give it time to at least try to make it right. Seriously. This speed at which this is going through, for the admittedly noble cause of protecting vulnerable farm and ranch workers that do not have protection, that is a noble cause. That's a cause I agree with. But in attempting to do that, you have gone too far. You have stretched too far, and you have extended the consequences of this legislation far beyond what you even intended. And when that error was pointed out to you, you said, oh, no, that wasn't our intention. I get that. But that is still what is believed in rural Alberta. And so it is your duty as the government, because we cannot convince you to do that. It is your duty to recognize that you're in error. It is your duty to recognize you have to push the pause button. And we gave you, I think, 8 different opportunities to improve this legislation, to change this legislation, to show the people of Alberta that, yes, you are listening and that you are consulting with them as you have promised you would, and you voted them all down. That's right. You voted every single amendment that would have approved this legislation down. And I ask you, given that you've done that, why should anyone in Alberta believe you that you're going to listen going forward?
Good question.
Why should anyone in Alberta have any confidence that the consultation going forward, the consultation that will happen after the legislation is passed, because you would not delay either the legislation or the coming into force date, why should they believe you now? Your actions last night spoke louder than words. You rejected every amendment that would have improved, that would have been amendments, not, yes, proposed by members on this side of the House, but they weren't our amendments. They were amendments that came from the people. So, Mr. Speaker, it's our job as legislators. It is our job as legislators at times to put aside the political. And that's what I've tried to do this morning. I've tried to think about my friend. I've tried to think about what would Mita say. And I'm going to actually, quite frankly, use him as something that is going to inspire me. I know he did, and he will continue to do so. And I'm speaking on behalf of the people that have contacted me, the 80-year-old grandfather who has 30 cows left, some of whom in cow years are just as old as he is in human years, and he goes out every morning to feed them and every night to feed them. And if it wasn't for those cows, he'd have no reason to live. And he's told me that. He said, if I don't feed those cows, if they get me out of bed in the morning, they give me a reason to live. But if we force a bunch of legislation on him, and you're saying, oh, no, we're not doing that. Well, that's not what your original legislation, that's not what the original documentation said. Right. And if Grandpa read that documentation, he still believes it because he wants to trust his government. And in order to undo that wrong, you need time. And you're not giving yourself time. The husband and wife who work 2 jobs, one in Lloydminster and one in Manville, and are driving back and forth between a job that they hold in Lloydminster and the farm that they have in Manville, who are now worried how this is going to affect because they hire and pay, not a neighbor, but a friend who works on the farm because they can't always be there. They're worried about how a carbon tax is going to affect the fact that they have to drive 82 kilometers both ways virtually every single day to look after their farm. The gentleman that contacted me that sent me a picture of 4 generations of his family along with a neighbor that had gotten on their horses to bring the cows home in the fall. He says, according to my reading of the information from this government, we won't be able to do this anymore. Unbelievable. They're worried about their lifestyle. And you have to understand that they're proud of that lifestyle. I think you do. I think you understand that. I'm not going to say, oh, because you're from the city, you have no comprehension. I don't think that's right. I think you understand that. I think in your heart of hearts you understand that. But these are the people that I feel for. These are the people, you know, the groups of friends and neighbors, and the honourable member for Barhead, Morinville, Westlock talked about it, and these stories happen every year in Alberta, where someone is hurt, someone can't finish doing the harvest, and the neighbors all come and they do it for them. That happens all the time. And you know what? That happens not just in urban Alberta, rural Alberta, it happens in urban Alberta. It's because that's who we are. That's being Albertan. And quite frankly, when we politicize these issues, rather than working together as legislators to try to improve legislation, that basically it demeans us and it makes us less in discharging our responsibility for doing what we are supposed to do. So, Mr. Speaker, I will be voting against this piece of legislation. I will vote against this legislation because I believe this legislation is wrong for Albertans. And I believe that although well-intentioned and although the things that are tried to be accomplished in terms of the insurance of basic human rights that nobody disagrees with, if it had been confined to that, then we could have all agreed and we would have righted something that should have been corrected a long time ago. I get that. But unfortunately, the approach the government has taken has been far too broad-stroked, far too broad-handed, far too ham-handed, and I said last night, you have not adopted a surgical approach to this. And because you've failed to do that, because you've put out misinformation that was then, I will say it, that was then multiplied and increased, but the initial source of that information was the government.
Bingo.
And so, Mr. Speaker, I will vote against Bill 6 in third reading, as I have throughout. I will say to my constituents back home that I was proud to do it. And, Mr. Speaker, my final comment on this issue was last Saturday in Vermillion, we had a town hall. And one of my constituents, somebody that probably, wants to remain anonymous, he spoke against this, and he just begged me to vote against this motion, vote against this bill. And that, Mr. Speaker, I'm proud to do today, and I would urge everyone on both sides of the House to vote against this bill.
There's still time.
Thank you, honourable member.